Listen, a question from Dominic Byrne on Twitter there yesterday, Johnny. He wanted to know how many lengths advantage the fence was at Rose Hill. You kindly handballed it to me.
Straight to you.
I asked Dom for his opinion as well, which he gladly gave. And look, he thinks that, more than 2 lengths is the number. I suppose there's no defined way to measure it. Everyone's going to have different ideas on that. We can sit there and speculate how the syndicates might play it. And obviously they're going to be looking at things like, performance versus expectation. And with lanes data, and accurate lanes data and wides and so forth, then you can sort of perhaps begin the process of breaking that down. What we used to do, of course, pre the availability of that type of data, was we'd sit there and make, anecdotal decisions based on what we see, I suppose, in terms of winners and place getters and, which horses went where and their SPs and so forth. So for me, it's probably a little bit greater than 2.5 lengths. If you look at the actual top 10 outperformers on Saturday, and the only reason, or so should I say, the only measure of that is their performance versus SP, then if you were to apply the full merit of that advantage or outperformance, then it would be too much. So I suppose it's a fractionalized version of that that you've got to come up with your own formulas. I use a formula that calculates it. I don't sit there and try and do it myself. It's all done through math and algorithms. I'm not saying my way is right. Everyone's got their own way of doing it. But look,
well, it's consistent, and that's a big part of the battle.
It's got to be consistent. It's got to be consistent. And if you're using ratings, whatever they are, weight ratings or performance ratings, which are probably more a hybrid of time and class, or just simply time ratings on their own, then you've got to think about the adjustment and what it does to your prices, don't you? So, a length between the horses is probably going to be half the price or double the price. So you got to think about what that's going to mean next time. So if it is 2.5 lengths or 2 lengths or 3 lengths, if you add that or take that off the horse, is that a reasonable, or is it too harsh on what your assessments are going to be going forward? Because what happens if the horse gets back into the same spot next time out? So, no absolute way of doing it. There was a further... Again,
I think you've got to sort of apply a little bit. If you're not, say yourself and everything's automated, you're trying to do it manually, you want to be... In poor races, you want to be harsher on the horses that were in the right spot, and in good races, you want to be more forgiving of horses that weren't in the right spot. And that's probably a good mix for people who aren't using technology and have the consistency. I think it's very easy to be over forgiving of horses that look like good runs in bad races is kind of what I mean. You don't want to, you still want to make sure there was merit in the race itself before you're adjusting too heavily and looking for horses that are coming out of certain races.
The follow-on point that Dominic made also was, there is an expectation that's built into the price pre-post for horses drawn the fence. And he gave an example of 2 horses with a 10% probability being after the draw, say 7-1 and 12-1, and they might start 11-2 and 20s. So, that's, I suppose, the effective bias that.
And I guess that changes as the day goes a bit too. Like I would assume that by the last, that's more aggressively priced in than, say, in the first.
Well, you see it, don't you? You see the movements on prices during the course of a meeting when there is a bias, and especially if that bias perhaps wasn't anticipated or expected, or more severe than expected, then you often see horses, shortening or blowing quite dramatically during the course of a day, as bookmakers try to realign their positions, I suppose, going into those races, because, if they've got people doing the form, which most of them probably don't, but if they do, then they're thinking about the same types of things. Whether or not these bias tracks are fair or not, I don't think they're fair. I made a comment on Twitter the other day about being a little bit astounded as to people whinging post meeting about the way the track plays. I mean, there is obviously an expectation going into the meeting, and that's really the point that I was trying to make. If you've got the data behind you and you put a little bit of work in, you should be able to have some sort of idea of how you think the track's going to play pre a meeting, and you build that into your assessment, surely.
Agree, and I someone started having a go last night, and I just sort of backed off because I couldn't be bothered. But saying it's not a good look, well, that's not anything to do with what we're trying to argue. And I think I'm pretty much down the same line as you. Is I'm not worried about the look. I'm worried about trying to set up a meeting and bet on it. And Rosehill to me is very, very consistent. And whether people like the look of it or not, I don't know. Whether they should run group races on there, I don't know. I like in these certain rail positions. That's a totally different argument. I just think the track played maybe slightly more aggressively than probably most people anticipated, but that's about it. It wasn't anything crazy, and I don't understand the outrage either.
Well, I understand the outrage when it comes to should it be that way, and I would say no. We don't really want bias in tracks. In an ideal world, if we could have tracks without bias, that would be great, but it just doesn't work that way. There are things that you can do to exacerbate it. It is, as Dominic talks about, offensive to present a track like that with such a rails bias, but it's probably equally offensive to present a track where the inside's doctored through artificial watering. So where do you draw the line?
That's the line. As a punter, like, what do you want? Do you want them to say, oh, listen, we've aerated the inside 4 metres there today. Good luck. And then what do? Just don't bet for the first half a dozen races trying to work out what the heck's going to go on. That's the problem. Like, the movable rails is probably the biggest influence on a lot of how these tracks play, I guess. But
yeah, well, rail and irrigation, right? Yeah. So
anyway, probably not for us to worry about.
Not for us to worry about. All we can do as punters is interpret it. I do agree it's unfair, and I do agree it's not a good look. But as punters, we're trying to find an edge, and astute punters will always try to use the tools that they've got before them to do so. So I think that's probably enough on that.